She had been missing for 18 years. 18 years of searches, of flyers, of candlelight vigils, of a mother who never stopped looking. And then one August morning in 2009, a man walked onto a college campus in Berkeley, California, accompanied by two pale, subdued young girls and a quiet woman who stayed close behind him, eyes cast downward, and without knowing it, unraveled every lie he had ever told. That woman had a name. The world had been searching for her since 1991. And the moment she finally said it out loud, said her own name after nearly 2 decades of silence, it broke something open in every person who heard it. Her name was Jaycee Dugard. This is her story. Quick question before we continue. Are you one of those people who listens to true crime while cooking, driving, cleaning, or are you fully locked in, lights dimmed, volume up? Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I want to know who's staying up way too late solving mysteries with me. If you're enjoying this deep dive, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more real cases every week. Now, let's go back to the beginning. South Lake Tahoe sits along the southern edge of Lake Tahoe, straddling the California-Nevada border like a postcard that never got sent. In the early 1990s, it was the kind of place where people moved specifically because they believed it was safe. The kind of place where children walked to school bus stops alone without anyone losing sleep over it. The Sierra Nevada mountains stretched in every direction. The air was cold and clean, and the community was tight-knit enough that strangers stood out. That was the whole point of moving there. In September 1990, Jaycee Dugard's family relocated from Arcadia, California, a suburb in Los Angeles County, to Myers, a quiet rural community just south of South Lake Tahoe, precisely because they believed it would be a safer environment for their children. Terry Probin, Jaycee's mother, wanted her daughter to grow up somewhere she didn't have to worry. Somewhere with open skies, neighbors who knew each other's names, and streets where an 11-year-old girl could walk without fear. It seemed like a good decision. Jaycee Lee Dugard was born on the 3rd of May, 1980. She lived with her mother Terry and her stepfather Carl Probin. In 1990, Carl and Terry had a baby girl named Shayna, giving Jaycee a little sister. By all accounts, Jaycee adored that baby. She was described as a warm, gentle child, the kind of kid who cared about animals, who kept journals, who lit up around the people she loved. She was close to her mother in a way that went beyond the ordinary. Terry wasn't just her parent, she was her anchor. A quiet but deep bond between two people who felt most themselves in each other's company. At the time of her abduction, Jaycee was in the 5th grade and was looking forward to an upcoming class field trip. She was 11 years old and on the cusp of everything, middle school, adolescence, the particular electric uncertainty of growing up. She had no reason to believe on the morning of the 10th of June 1991 that the walk to a bus stop would be her last act of ordinary freedom for nearly 2 decades. That morning, Jaycee was dressed in her favorite all-pink outfit when she headed down her street toward the bus stop. A normal Tuesday morning, a short walk she had taken dozens of times before. Carl Probin was nearby in the garage, close enough to see her but far enough that he couldn't react in time to what came next. A grey car slowed beside her. While testifying years later, Dugard recalled thinking a car was pulling up behind her because someone needed directions. That's what a child thinks. That's the kind of innocent interpretation an 11-year-old makes in a neighborhood where people look out for each other, in a town her mother had chosen for its safety. It wasn't someone looking for directions. The car pulled up, and Phillip Garrido rolled down the window, shot Jaycee with a stun gun, and pulled her into the vehicle with the help of his wife, Nancy, who was sitting in the passenger seat. Carl Probin witnessed the abduction through his home's garage window and immediately gave chase on his bicycle, but the car was already accelerating and he could not keep up. He watched his stepdaughter disappear inside an unfamiliar vehicle and kept pedaling long after the car was gone, as if sheer willpower could somehow undo what he had just witnessed. He called police immediately. Within hours, the search had begun. Law enforcement at the federal, state, and local levels swarmed the area. Flyers were distributed throughout the region. Neighborhoods were canvassed and residents interviewed. Thousands of tips flooded in. Search dogs and teams fanned out across the surrounding landscape. The community mobilized with the urgency of parents who understood, viscerally, that this could have been anyone's child. Many South Lake Tahoe families pulled their children a little closer that week. They double-checked their locks. They watched the streets with new suspicion. But Jaycee was already gone. And here is where the story takes its first haunting turn, because someone had actually seen the car. Carl Probin had seen it. Others in the neighborhood glimpsed the abduction. There were witnesses. There was physical evidence, the stun gun marks on a child who had been taken in broad daylight from a street within sight of her own home. And yet, despite the immediate response, despite the dogs, the aircraft, the hundreds of officers, the FBI's involvement brought no one closer to finding Jaycee. And for nearly 2 decades, it seemed as though she had simply ceased to exist. Why? Why did the investigation collapse so completely and so quickly? The answer to that question lives in a suburb of San Francisco, a house on Walnut Avenue in Antioch, California, about 170 miles southwest of where Jaycee had been taken. And at the center of that answer is a man named Phillip Craig Garrido. Garrido was born on the 5th of April, 1951, in Pittsburgh, California. By the time Jaycee was kidnapped, he had already left a trail of violence through multiple counties and 2 states, a trail that law enforcement somehow never connected to the little girl in the pink outfit who vanished from a bus stop in South Lake Tahoe. After graduating from high school in 1969, Garrido began struggling with substance abuse and was arrested for possession. In 1972, he was arrested for drugging and raping a 4-year-old girl, though charges were ultimately dropped when the victim refused to testify. That was the first warning sign. The first time the system had a chance to stop him and didn't, the pattern continued. His first confirmed assault on record was a rape and kidnapping in Antioch in April 1972. 4 years later, in June 1976, he committed another rape and kidnapping in South Lake Tahoe, the same town where Jaycee Dugard would later disappear. Then in November 1976, he attacked again, raping and kidnapping a woman in South Lake Tahoe. That final attack led to his conviction in federal court for kidnapping and in state court for rape. His victim in that case was a 25-year-old woman named Katie Calloway Hall. Garrido had abducted her in California, transported her across state lines to Reno, Nevada, and raped her inside a warehouse. The crime was appalling. The sentence reflected that, or it should have. For that crime, Garrido received a 50-year federal sentence. 50 years. He should have been in prison until 2026, long past the age when he could threaten anyone. He served 11. The U.S. Parole Commission released Garrido from federal prison on the 20th of January 1988. California's Inspector General later called this decision inexplicable. A man who had kidnapped and raped multiple women, who had already been given multiple chances by the system and used each one to commit further violence, walked out of federal prison and began his parole. And here is what makes it worse. He and his wife Nancy, whom he had met and married while incarcerated, moved to the city of Antioch and lived in the home of his elderly mother who suffered from dementia. As a parolee, Garrido wore a GPS-enabled ankle bracelet and was regularly visited by parole officers, local sheriff's deputies, and federal agents. He was being watched. He was being monitored. He had a tracking device on his ankle. And 3 years after walking out of prison, still on federal parole, he drove to South Lake Tahoe, shocked an 11-year-old girl with a stun gun, and drove her 170 miles to his house. The investigation in South Lake Tahoe never looked his way. Jaycee had been kidnapped without a trace, and unfortunately, the intense microscope of investigation never reached the Bay Area, never focused on sexual predator and parolee Phillip Garrido. The question of why is one of the most chilling aspects of this case. At the time of the kidnapping, Garrido had a history of committing crimes, specifically in the South Lake Tahoe region, the exact same area where Jaycee disappeared. He was a registered sex offender on parole for kidnapping and rape. He wore an ankle bracelet. He was supposed to be supervised. And yet the investigators looking for an 11-year-old girl taken from a bus stop in South Lake Tahoe never connected the dots to a known violent predator who had previously attacked women in that very community. Garrido drove back to Antioch and locked Jaycee in a shed in his backyard. She was 11 years old, in handcuffs, in the dark, 170 miles from home. On the first night, Garrido forced Jaycee, still in handcuffs, to shower with him, and he raped her. Afterward, as she broke down sobbing, he offered to comfort her. In her memoir, published 2 decades later, Jaycee described the disorientation of that moment, the predator offering comfort after inflicting trauma, the terrifying intimacy of a captor trying to be gentle after being monstrous. She wrote that she felt like a rabbit being comforted by a lion. She was still in her pink outfit from that morning. Jaycee's own words later captured the confusion of those early days in captivity. She kept telling Garrido she wanted to go home. She told him she didn't understand why he was doing this. She even suggested to him that if this was a ransom situation, her family didn't have a lot of money. She was trying to reason with him, trying to find any logic in what was happening, but there was no logic. There was only Phillip Garrido and his wife Nancy, and the backyard compound of tents, sheds, and lean-tos that would become Jaycee's entire world for 18 years. Investigators would later confirm that Dugard had been kept in concealed tents, sheds, and lean-tos in an area behind the Garrido's house at 1554 Walnut Avenue in Antioch, California, where Phillip repeatedly raped her during the first 6 years of her captivity. During those early years, Garrido controlled Jaycee through a combination of physical restraint, fear, and psychological manipulation. He told her that vicious dogs outside would attack her if she tried to escape. He told her that God was watching, that if she tried to leave, terrible things would happen to her and her family. He constructed an entire psychological prison around a child who was already physically imprisoned. And back in South Lake Tahoe, her family was falling apart with grief. Terry Probyn never accepted that her daughter was gone. She held on to the hope that Jaycee was alive somewhere, even when the investigation went quiet, even when the tips dried up, even when the years began to stack up in ways that felt unbearable. She kept Jaycee's room exactly as it was. She continued to speak about her daughter in the present tense. She did what mothers do when the alternative is too devastating to contemplate. She refused to stop believing. Carl Probyn, Jaycee's stepfather, was the one who had watched it happen. He had been close enough to witness and too far away to stop it. The guilt of that moment never fully left him. He had chased the car on a bicycle, he had called the police, he had done everything a person could do, and it still wasn't enough. For years, he remained one of the most visible advocates for Jaycee's case, speaking publicly, keeping her name in the news. The case was repeatedly featured on America's Most Wanted. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children conducted age progression analyses of what Jaycee might look like as she grew older, releasing updated images every 2 years. Tips came in and went nowhere. The case became one of California's most haunting cold cases, a little girl who had been kidnapped in front of a witness in a neighborhood in broad daylight and had simply vanished into silence. Meanwhile, somewhere behind a fence in Antioch, something was happening that the world wouldn't know about for almost 2 decades. 3 years into her captivity, the Garridos began to allow Jaycee some freedom from her handcuffs for periods, though they kept her locked in the bolted compound. Small mercies strategically granted the loosening of a physical chain to tighten a psychological one. Garrido understood intuitively what researchers would later spend careers studying, that prolonged captivity doesn't require constant force. Over time, the walls of the mind become more effective than any fence. Then, in 1994, Jaycee became pregnant. She was 13 years old. On Easter Sunday, 1994, the Garridos told Jaycee she was pregnant. She gave birth to her first daughter on the 18th of August 1994 while locked in a shed in the backyard compound. The birth took place with no painkillers, no medical equipment, no doctors or nurses, in a soundproof shed, alone except for Nancy Garrido. Jaycee was 14 years old when she became a mother. What no one could have anticipated, not even Jaycee herself, in those earliest days of bewildering pain, was that this child would become her reason to survive. She poured every ounce of love she had into that tiny girl. Throughout her captivity, Jaycee constantly thought of her own mother, replaying memories of the warmth and safety she had once known. Those memories kept her anchored to the idea that one day she would find her way back. Her daughters gave her the same anchor, a living, breathing reason to endure another day. 3 years later, in November 1997, Jaycee gave birth to a second daughter in that same shed when she was 17 years old. Now, there were 3 of them, Jaycee and her 2 daughters, hidden behind an 8-foot fence in a suburban backyard in Antioch. The girls grew up in tents. They had no birth certificates, no medical records, no contact with the outside world beyond the walls of their compound. The garridos demanded that Jaycee's daughters call Nancy mom and refer to Jaycee herself as their older sister. They denied Jaycee the right to be their mother. Think about that for a moment. Jaycee had given birth to both children, had raised them, had taught them everything they knew, reading, math, the names of things, with nothing but a 5th grade education and a mother's determination. And she was not allowed to be called their mother. She was their sister, their captor's wife was their mother. Every piece of Jaycee's identity, her name, her history, her role as a parent had been systematically erased and replaced with whatever fiction served Phillip Garrido's needs. Her name inside that compound was Alyssa. When Garrido discovered that she was signing her real name in a journal she kept about some kittens the Garridos had given her, she was forced to tear out the page containing her name, and that was the last time she would be permitted to say or write the name Jaycee until her captivity ended 18 years later. She was not allowed to be herself. Not even on paper, not even in a private journal, not even in her own handwriting. The kittens, incidentally, later vanished. The garridos manipulated Dugard further by presenting her on 2 occasions with kittens that would later mysteriously vanish. Every small comfort, every tiny connection to normalcy was offered and then taken away, a recurring psychological pattern designed to reinforce her dependence on her captors and her powerlessness against them. And all of this was happening in a house that was being visited by parole officers. This is the part of the story where the narrative stops feeling like a tragedy and starts feeling like an institutional failure, so profound it borders on the incomprehensible. While on parole, officers visited the house 60 times to check on Garrido. Not once did they check the backyard where Dugard was held captive. Garrido also wore a GPS tracker, which revealed the numerous trips he made to the backyard, but the device was not monitored closely by officers at the time. 60 visits over more than a decade. And the backyard, the enclosed, fenced, screened backyard where 3 human beings were living in tents and sheds, was never once properly examined. There were utility wires, visible wires running from the house toward the concealed compound. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation later confirmed they failed to investigate the visible utility wires running from Garrido's house toward the hidden compound where Jaycee Dugard was kept prisoner. Those wires were there on every visit. They were not subtle. They ran from the main house to the hidden living area like a physical map of what was being concealed, and no one followed them. How did this happen? How does a system fail so completely for so long? California Inspector General David Shaw would later explain that the problems began when Garrido was classified as a low-risk sex offender, a classification that was fundamentally incompatible with his history as a violent, repeat predator. It's apparent that this initial mistake set the tone for many mistakes to come, Shaw said. The Inspector General's review found that Garrido's parole officers missed several chances to discover Dugard, and the failure rate was staggering. Under California's jurisdiction, Garrido was properly supervised for just 12 out of 123 months, a failure rate of approximately 90%. 90%! A California official acknowledged that each parole officer was restricted to spending just 45 minutes per week on each of their cases. That's what the state's budget constraints reduced supervision to 45 minutes a week for one of the most dangerous sexual predators in California's recent history. But the failures weren't only bureaucratic, they were human. People had chances to see what was right in front of them and looked away. In 1991, the very year of Jaycee's kidnapping, a neighbor reportedly spotted a young blonde girl in Garrido's backyard. The girl identified herself by the name Jaycee and said she lived there. Then Garrido came out and took her back indoors. That neighbor reported what they had seen. The report went nowhere. Then, in 2006, 15 years into Jaycee's captivity, a neighbor called 911. A neighbor reported that women and children were living in tents behind Garrido's house. A Contra Costa County Sheriff's deputy responded, but spoke to Garrido only in the front yard and did not search the property. The deputy was apparently unaware that Garrido was a registered sex offender. Women and children living in tents in the backyard of a known sex offender's home. The deputy spoke to Garrido at the front door and left. Contra Costa County Sheriff Warren Ruff would later acknowledge publicly, "We should have been more inquisitive, more curious, and turned over a rock or two. We missed an opportunity to bring earlier closure to this situation." He was understating it. In 2008, a parole officer found a young girl in Garrido's house, a direct violation of his parole conditions, and did nothing. Nothing. A child in a paroled sex offender's home. A clear violation, and nothing happened. If any single one of these moments had been handled differently, the 1,991 sighting, the 2006 neighbor complaint, the 2008 parole violation, Jaycee Dugard might have been free years earlier. The two daughters born in captivity might have known a different world. Her mother back in South Lake Tahoe might not have spent nearly 2 more decades not knowing if her daughter was alive. But none of those moments resulted in the truth being uncovered. What finally did the thing that unraveled 18 years of concealment was a man's arrogance and the sharp instincts of 2 women who noticed something wasn't right. By 2009, Phillip Garrido's behavior had grown increasingly erratic. Neighbors described him as creepy, a man who had established what he called a church named God's Desire and claimed to hear God's voice. He would break into song unprompted. He sometimes behaved strangely around teenage girls. He had been deteriorating for some time, consumed by a particular strain of religious mania that led him to believe he had a divine mission to share with the world. That belief was about to be his undoing. On the 24th of August 2009, Phillip Garrido took Jaycee's 2 daughters, then aged 15 and 11, to the campus of the University of California at Berkeley. He told campus officials he wanted to hold a religious event on campus and was seeking a permit. The daughters went everywhere with him now. Garrido had begun taking them out into the world to distribute religious materials, to accompany him on errands. They served as a kind of performance of normalcy. 2 girls who appeared to be his children, helping their father spread his message. But nothing about them seemed normal to the people who encountered them that day. Lisa Campbell of the department's Special Events Unit and Officer Ally Jacobs both sensed that something was wrong almost immediately. The girls seemed sullen, submissive, and pale, like they lacked exposure to sunlight. Campbell and Jacobs began questioning them, asking their names and where they went to school. Garrido, meanwhile, volunteered that he had been convicted of rape and kidnapping 33 years earlier, but said he was now doing God's work. That admission, casual, almost proud, landed differently than Garrido intended. He seemed to believe that his current devotion to God wiped the slate clean. Instead, it made the officers more suspicious, not less. One of the girls, when asked which church they attended, replied, "We go to church in our basement." When asked how many people were in the congregation, she said 5. When asked who the pastor was, she said, "My dad." The officer asking the questions was, by his own account, shocked by the response. Garrido made an appointment to return the next day and was allowed to leave. But Campbell and Jacobs were not done. After Garrido left, Jacobs ran a background check and discovered his status as a registered sex offender who was on parole after being released from federal prison in 1988 for kidnapping and rape. Crucially, his parole officer had no idea he had children. Parole officer Edward Santos Jr. was contacted immediately. He had been Garrido's supervising officer since December 2008, barely 8 months on the case. This was the man who would, within the next 48 hours, come face to face with one of the longest running kidnapping cases in California history. Santos ordered Garrido to bring the two girls to a parole office in Concord, California on August 26. Garrido arrived and brought more than just the girls. He brought Nancy, he brought his two daughters, and he brought the quiet woman who went by the name Alyssa, who stood slightly apart from the others and said very little. Garrido insisted that Alyssa and the two girls were relatives. He maintained the fiction calmly at first, but he was beginning to crack under the accumulated pressure of the interrogation. Santos pressed him. The questions circled closer to the truth. And somewhere in that room, after 18 years of silence, 18 years of living under a name that wasn't hers, of raising children she couldn't claim as her own, of surviving things that would have broken most people long ago, Phillip Garrido finally ran out of lies. I kidnapped her and raped her when she was a child, he told Santos. And then Jaycee spoke. She told him her real name, the name she hadn't been allowed to say for 18 years, the name she had been forced to tear out of a journal so her captor wouldn't see it, the name her mother had whispered in prayers every night for nearly 2 decades. Jaycee Lee Dugard. She later said of that moment, "My name is Jaycee Dugard, and I want to say that because for a long time I wasn't able to say my name, and so it feels good." She was 29 years old. She had been 11 when she was taken. She had lost her adolescence, her education, her freedom, her name. She had given birth twice in a shed without medical care, in a backyard compound that California's own parole system had visited 60 times without seeing. And on the 26th of August 2009, she walked out. The news broke that evening and cascaded across every television screen in the country. Jaycee Dugard, a name that many people only knew from a milk carton or in America's Most Wanted segment, a name attached to a school photograph of a smiling girl in pigtails, was alive. She was 29 years old. She had 2 daughters. She had survived. In South Lake Tahoe, Terry Probin received the call she had been waiting 18 years for. That same evening, the 26th of August 2009, Jaycee was reunited with her mother. There are no adequate words for what that reunion was. 18 years of not knowing. 18 years of hoping against every statistical probability of holding on to something that most people would have long since let go. And then a phone call. And then her daughter, Phillip and Nancy Garrido, were arrested and charged immediately. They faced 29 felony counts, including rape and false imprisonment. Phillip and Nancy Garrido pleaded guilty in April 2011 to kidnapping, sexual assault, false imprisonment, lewd conduct with a minor, and child pornography. On the 2nd of June 2011, Phillip was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison. Nancy was sentenced to 36 years to life, also in June 2011. Jaycee did not attend the sentencing. She sent a written statement which her mother read aloud in court on her behalf. The statement captured something that deserves to be understood, not the rage of a victim, but the clarity of a survivor. "As I think of all those years, I am angry because you stole my life and that of my family," the statement read. "Thankfully, I am doing well now and no longer live in a nightmare. I have wonderful friends and family around me, something you can never take from me again. You do not matter anymore." He did not matter anymore. After 18 years of Phillip Garrido consuming every dimension of her existence, she had reduced him to those 4 words: "You do not matter anymore." The legal reckoning extended beyond the criminal court. Because Garrido had been on parole for his 1,976 rape at the time of her kidnapping, Jaycee sued the state of California for the numerous lapses by law enforcement that had contributed to her continued captivity and ongoing assault. In July 2010, The state approved a settlement of $20 million to compensate her for what the state itself described as various lapses by the corrections department that contributed to her captivity and abuse. $20 million. It is an enormous sum. It is also a number that exists only because the system designed to protect people like Jaycee Dugard failed her repeatedly over the course of 18 years in ways that an official government review confirmed were preventable. Among the documented failures, releasing Garrido after just 11 years of a 50-year sentence, granting him early termination of federal parole in 1999 based on a clean record while he was actively holding Jaycee captive, failing to obtain key background information from federal parole authorities when California took over supervision, failing to investigate visible utility wires running from the house toward the concealed compound, and repeatedly classifying a violent, multiple offense sexual predator as a low-risk offender. The Inspector General's review was devastating. It didn't use language designed to soften the findings. A subsequent court document summarized the situation plainly. Garrido was a parolee with a terrible history of drug-fueled sexual violence, and state and federal authorities missed many opportunities to stop these tragic events. Many opportunities. Not one, not a single oversight that could be attributed to bad luck or limited information. Many opportunities over many years in a system supposedly designed to prevent exactly this kind of outcome. The questions raised by this case about parole supervision, about how violent offenders are classified and monitored, about what happens when 911 calls go uninvestigated and neighbor complaints get filed and forgotten, outlasted the court proceedings. California passed new legislation in the wake of the Dugard case, increasing the requirements for supervising high-risk sex offenders and improving communication between parole officers and local law enforcement. Reforms that were long overdue, reforms that came too late for Jaycee. And what of Jaycee herself? This is the part of her story that belongs entirely to her. And she has been remarkably generous in sharing pieces of it, even as she has fought fiercely to protect the privacy of her daughters and the quiet life she has rebuilt since 2009. There were early theories that Jaycee had developed what's known as Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological response in which captives form attachments to their captors. Jaycee pushed back on this with force and clarity. It's degrading having my family believe that I was in love with this captor and wanted to stay with him, she said in an ABC News interview in 2016. I mean, that is so far from the truth that it makes me want to throw up. It's disgusting. I adapted to survive my circumstances. There's just no other way to put it. She was direct. He was always my captor. I never forgot that. Never. She also addressed the question that people asked, perhaps more than any other, why she didn't try to escape. The answer, characteristically, was both honest and practical. She told authorities she was too afraid of her captors to attempt escape. Garrido had threatened to use the stun gun on her again. He claimed Doberman pinchers would attack her if she left the compound. And beyond the fear, there was something else. I couldn't leave, she said. I had the girls. She would not leave without her daughters, and she could not safely take them with her. So she stayed. Not because she had forgotten who she was or accepted her situation, but because she was a mother. Because the children she had been forced to bear had become the people she loved most in the world. And protecting them meant enduring whatever she had to endure. That is not a syndrome, that is a mother. In 2011, Jaycee published her memoir, A Stolen Life. In an interview around that time, she described what she had needed to do in order to survive. There's a switch that I had to shut off, she said. So, it's just you do what you have to do to survive. The book was raw and unflinching, not a polished account designed to resolve neatly into lessons, but an honest document of what it actually felt like to live through what she had lived through. It spent weeks on bestseller lists and was translated into multiple languages. 5 years later, she published a second book, Freedom, My Book of Firsts. Focused on her reintegration into the world, the ordinary experiences she had missed across 18 years and was encountering for the first time as an adult, learning to drive, getting her first real haircut, tasting things, doing things, moving through the world as a person with choices. The book was, in its way, as moving as the first, not about trauma, but about what comes after, about the possibility of ordinary joy. In 2019, 10 years after her rescue, she posed with her horse Cowboy for a photo provided to the Bay Area news group, a quiet image of a woman who had found, against all probability, something like peace. She also built something. Jaycee founded the Jaycee Foundation, which helps families recover from abduction and other traumatic experiences, providing support to the people who fall into the gap between crisis and recovery, who need help but don't know where to find it. She turned her suffering into infrastructure, into a framework designed to make sure that other families navigating the incomprehensible had somewhere to turn. In her acceptance speech at the 2012 DVF Awards at the United Nations, Jaycee said, "My hope is to be remembered for what I do, not for what happened to me." That line says everything. Her daughters, the two young women born in captivity, who grew up in a hidden compound in a suburban backyard, who were told their mother was their sister and their captor was their father, went on to attend college. Jaycee retained custody of both daughters and has kept their lives private. They are adults now, navigating a world that dealt them an extraordinarily difficult starting hand in ways we can only imagine and will not speculate about here, because they deserve the privacy Jaycee has so carefully protected for them. One thread of this story does not resolve cleanly. Phillip Garrido was named the suspect in at least one other California kidnapping case, the 1988 abduction of 9-year-old Michaela Garrick in Hayward. California, though, he was never charged in connection with that case. Michaela's mother, Sharon Murch, has spent decades seeking answers. The question of whether Garrido was involved in other disappearances beyond Jaycee's remains open, an uncomfortable loose end in a case where so many things that should have been investigated were not. According to El Dorado County District Attorney records, Jaycee Dugard was Phillip Garrido's fifth identified victim. 4 of his previous victims had also been attacked in South Lake Tahoe. The full scope of his crimes across all those years may never be completely known. What we do know is this. A little girl in a pink outfit walked to a bus stop on a Tuesday morning in June 1991. She was taken by people who had no right to her, who stripped away her name and her freedom and the ordinary trajectory of her life. She survived things that should have killed the spirit: years of abuse, isolation, psychological manipulation, 2 childbirths in a shed with no medical care, 18 years under a name that wasn't hers. She survived all of it. And when she finally walked into a parole office on a Wednesday in August 2009 and said her own name out loud, she wasn't just identifying herself to law enforcement. She was reclaiming something that had been forcibly taken, the simplest, most fundamental thing a person has: the fact of who they are. The system that should have protected Jaycee Dugard failed her at nearly every turn, from the inexplicable early release of her captor, to the years of inadequate parole supervision, to the neighbor complaints that went uninvestigated, to the visible signs of concealed habitation that 60 home visits somehow missed. California acknowledged this failure with a $20 million settlement. It changed its laws. It overhauled its procedures. But for every reformed regulation, there is still the image of Terry Probin spending 18 years not knowing if her daughter was alive. There is still Carl Probin watching a car disappear and pedaling after it on a bicycle that could never catch up. There are still 2 little girls growing up in tents, being taught whatever their captive mother could teach them, with a 5th grade education and a determination to give them something better than the world they've been born into. The institutional reforms matter. They are necessary, but they exist because a child paid for them with her childhood. What has Jaycee Dugard said about all of it? About the years lost, the system that failed her, the people who missed the signs? In one of her interviews, she reflected, "Funny how I can look back now and notice how the secret backyard didn't really look so secret. It makes me believe no one cared or was even really looking for me. The government failed me for 18 years. And that will take time to heal from. It makes me believe no one cared or was even really looking for me. That sentence sits heavily because people were looking, her mother never stopped looking, the investigators in South Lake Tahoe had worked the case, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had updated her age progression images every 2 years. People were looking in the right spirit, they just weren't looking in the right direction. And the system that should have been watching the man responsible was, by its own admission, doing its job only 12% of the time. The Concord police sergeant who was present when Jaycee revealed her identity, who was one of the first people in the room when she said her name, later reflected on the experience. I could see that strength early on, he said. She is, without a doubt, the most courageous, positive, and resilient person I have ever met. Her ordeal would have broken most people, but not Jaycee. There is something in this case that resists the usual framework of true crime narratives. It is not ultimately a story about a perpetrator, though Phillip Garrido's crimes are central to everything. It is not a story about an investigation, though the investigation's failures demand examination. It is, at its core, a story about survival, about a woman who refused across 18 years of unfathomable circumstances to stop being herself, even when her name had been taken from her, even when the walls of the world had been reduced to a backyard in Antioch, even when the people who should have been looking were looking the wrong way. Jaycee Dugard found her way back, not just to her mother, not just to her daughters, whom she can now openly call her daughters, not just to a life with a horse named Cowboy and a foundation that bears her initials and a quiet home in California that she doesn't have to share with anyone she didn't choose. She found her way back to her name. And after everything is the thing she said felt good. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video so more people can find it, and subscribe if you want to be part of a community that takes these cases seriously, that treats real people like the full human beings they are, not just headlines. New cases, deep dives, every week. Jaycee Dugard is still out there, still building, still healing, still, by every account, choosing to let what happened to her be part of her story, but not all of it, not even close to all of it. Her hope, as she said herself, is to be remembered for what she does. So remember her for that.